She rescued a Comanche chief's son from quicksand. 3 days later, he returned with his entire tribe. The wind came first, long, dry, and restless. It scraped across the plains of West Texas, carrying the smell of dust and mesquite. The year was 1847, and the frontier was a cruel place for those who dared to live on it. Clara Whitlock had been living alone for nearly 2 years now, since her husband, Elias, never came back from a cattle drive that went bad somewhere near the Brazos. She had buried her grief in chores, chopping wood, mending fences, and praying that the roof held through the storms. Her small homestead sat at the edge of nowhere, surrounded by dry grass that glowed gold beneath the sun. She had no company but Mule, a few chickens, and the memory of a man she once loved. The silence had become both her comfort and her punishment. That morning, Clara was hauling water from the creek, a narrow, winding stream that cut to the red earth like a scar. Her bonnet shaded her face from the burning light, but sweat still trickled down her neck. The bucket handle dug into her palms, and she muttered to herself, "Another day in God's country, if he's still watching." Then came the sound. At first it was faint, something between a cry and a gasp. She stopped, heart-thudding, listening. The prairie was quiet again for a moment, only the wind moving through the reeds. Then it came again, a sharp, desperate scream. Clara dropped the bucket. "Good Lord!" she whispered, scanning the brush. The sound came from downriver, near the bend where the soil turned soft after spring floods. Without thinking, she ran. Her boots kicked up dust. The hem of her dress tangled around her legs as she scrambled through the scrub. And then she saw him. A boy no older than 10 was trapped waist-deep in a patch of quicksand, his small hands clawing at the mud. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and panic shone in his eyes. The more he struggled, the faster he sank. "Stop moving," Clara shouted. "You'll go under." The boy didn't understand her words. His cries were in another tongue, sharp and musical like the wind over stone. But fear spoke louder than language. She looked around frantically, spotted a long mesquite branch near the bank. She grabbed it and crawled closer, feeling the ground give under her knees. "Here!" she yelled, thrusting the branch toward him. "Grab it, boy." He flailed, his hand missing the stick once, twice. Then finally he caught it, his small fingers gripped tight. Clara braced her boots in the dry soil and pulled with all her strength. Come on now, don't you let go," she grunted. It felt like pulling against death itself. The suction fought her, tugging the boy downward even as she strained. Her muscles screamed, the branch bowed, and for a heartbeat she thought she'd lose him. Then, suddenly, the weight broke free. The boy tumbled forward onto the bank, covered in mud and gasping like a fish. Clara collapsed beside him, panting, her heart hammering. For a moment neither moved. Only the soft sound of water and wind filled the air. When she finally looked at him, she noticed the beads and paint on his arms, the feather tied in his hair. His skin was dark bronze, his eyes, black and deep as obsidian, watched her with wild mistrust. "Oh, mercy," she whispered. "You're a Comanche." The boy didn't answer, only drew his knees up, trembling. Clara glanced around the silent plains. The realization came cold and heavy. If there was one Comanche boy out here, there might be others watching from the hills. She stood slowly, scanning the ridge lines. Nothing moved. No riders, no dust trails. Just the still heat of afternoon. "Lord, help me," she muttered, looking back at the boy. He was shivering violently now, exhaustion overtaking him. Against every instinct of caution, she knelt beside him, draped her shawl over his shoulders, and whispered, "You're safe now, son. I'll get you warm." The boy blinked up at her, uncomprehending, but his breathing began to slow. Clara helped him to his feet, his small body shaking from cold and fear. She guided him toward her cabin, each step through the brittle grass echoing with uncertainty. Behind them, the quicksand pit gurgled softly, closing over the hole where death nearly claimed him. And as the sun sank lower on the horizon, painting the plains in blood-red light, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just done something that would change her life forever. She just didn't know yet how deeply. The door creaked as Clara pushed it open with her shoulder, half dragging the boy inside. The air within her small cabin was cool and dim, smelling faintly of smoke and dried sage. "Sit here," she murmured, guiding him toward the hearth. The boy stumbled once, still weak from his struggle in the quicksand. His bare feet left muddy prints on the floorboards. Clara threw a few dry sticks on the fire, coaxing the flame to life. The warmth spread to the room in slow, flickering waves. Shadows danced along the log walls, catching the glint of the boy's wet hair. He sat motionless, watching everything: the kettle, the rifle above the door, the framed tintype of Clara and her husband on the mantel. His eyes were wide, sharp, and silent. "Don't look at me like that," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "You're safe here, I promise." She fetched an old quilt from her bed and wrapped it around his shoulders. His small body was trembling, his teeth chattering quietly. She could see the marks on his skin, red from the pull of the sand, and the faded paint streaks on his arms. The sight made her chest tighten. He's just a child, she thought. Some mother out there is worried sick. "All right," she said gently. "We need to get you warm and fed." Clara poured water into a pot and set on the fire. She added beans, a scrap of salt pork, and stirred it slowly. The smell of food filled the room, simple and homely. The boy's eyes followed her every move. When she turned, he quickly looked away, pretending to study the fire. "Hungry?" she asked. He didn't answer, just stared at her, his face unreadable. She pointed to the pot, then to him. "Food," she said, touching her mouth. He hesitated, then nodded once, barely. When the stew was ready, Clara ladled a portion into a wooden bowl and handed it to him. He sniffed it cautiously before taking a bite. His hands shook, and his first mouthful was small and careful. She watched him eat, slow at first, then faster, as if realizing it was safe. He didn't look up until the bowl was empty. "Well," she said softly, "guess you were hungry after all." For a long moment, they just sat there, the only sound the pop and hiss of the fire. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and finally spoke again. "My name's Clara. Clara Whitlock." The boy looked at her, uncertain. She touched her chest. "Clara." Then she pointed at him gently. "You." He hesitated, then whispered something, his first word since she'd found him. "Tawa." It came out soft, like wind through tall grass. "Tawa," she repeated carefully. "Is that your name?" He nodded once, his eyes darting toward the window, as if expecting someone to peer outside. Clara followed his gaze. The night had fallen thick and moonless. The wind rattled the shutters, carrying the long cry of a coyote from somewhere far away. She shivered. The plains always felt lonelier after sunset. When she looked back, Tawa was fighting sleep, his head nodding against the quilt. She stoked the fire higher, then placed another blanket near him. "You can stay tonight," she said quietly. "But at first light, we'll see what needs doing." He didn't understand her words, but he must have felt her tone. He laid down without protest, curling near the hearth. Clara sat in her rocking chair, watching the flames reflect in his eyes until they fluttered shut. Outside, the wind carried whispers across the dark prairie, sounds that could have been wolves, or the echoes of riders too far to see. Clara clasped her hands, her knuckles white. "Lord," she whispered, "if I've done wrong bringing him here, guide me through it." The fire cracked softly. The boy breathed slow and even, and for the first time in years, Clara felt a presence in the cabin other than her own. But she couldn't shake one gnawing thought that followed her into uneasy sleep. If that child belongs to a Comanche chief, someone's going to come looking for him. The first light of dawn came slow and pale, spilling over the plains like milk over a dark table. The wind was still, and for once, the land seemed to hold its breath. Clara rose from her chair, her neck stiff, her skirt still rumpled from where she dozed half the night. The fire had burned low, its glow now just amber coals. She glanced toward the hearth. Tawa was still there, asleep, curled beneath her quilt, his face softened by dreams. For a moment, he looked no different from any boy she might have known. Innocent, human. She moved quietly, careful not to wake him. She pushed open the door and stepped into the morning chill. The smell of dew and earth hit her nose. A fine mist hung low over the grass. She stretched, taking a deep breath, and then she froze. Just beyond her fence, the ground was patterned with tracks. Dozens of them, hoof prints deep and fresh, circling the cabin like ghosts that had danced around her in the night. Her heart gave a slow, heavy thud. She knelt, tracing one of the prints with her fingertips. The edges were sharp. Whoever made them had passed through only hours ago. And they weren't cattle tracks. They were horses, wild and lean. War horses. Clara rose slowly, eyes scanning the horizon. The prairie stretched empty as far as she could see. No riders, no dust trails, no sound but the faint whisper of wind. Still, she felt them, watching. She turned and hurried back inside, her pulse quick and uneven. Tawa had stirred awake, sitting up groggily. His eyes followed her movements as she reached for her rifle hanging over the hearth. "What's wrong?" he asked softly in Comanche. The words were low and fast, but his tone carried the question clearly enough. Clara glanced at him, realizing again how helpless they were with no shared language. She pointed toward the door, then mimed the motion of riding. "Horses," she said firmly. "Out there." The boy stiffened. His expression changed instantly, eyes narrowing, shoulders squaring. He muttered something urgent under his breath and darted to the window. He pressed his small hands to the glass, peering out at the empty plains. Then he turned back to her, speaking fast, a stream of words she couldn't follow. "Slow down," she said helplessly. I can't." But he was already moving, grabbing the small satchel she'd left by the door, checking the latch on her rifle, pointing toward the North Hills. His face told her everything she needed to know. They were his people, and they were close. Clara's throat went dry. "Dear Lord," she whispered. "They came looking." Tawa looked back at her, then to the rifle in her hands. For the first time, she saw fear, not for himself, but for her. He shook his head quickly and pointed toward the back of the cabin. Then he gestured. "Hide! Run!" Clara swallowed hard. "I can't just leave you out there, boy." He shook his head again, more insistent this time, his eyes pleading. "Go!" he said, one English word, clear and urgent. She hesitated, torn between reason and compassion. But before she could answer, the faint sound of hooves echoed across the morning silence. She turned toward the door. Her eyes widened. Far out beyond the ridge, she saw them, riders, small dark figures cresting the rise, the light flashing off metal and feather, moving slow, deliberate, like hunters who already knew where the prey had gone. Tawa stepped closer, his small frame trembling. He pointed toward the creek, toward the line of trees that led north. "I go," he said. Claire understood. He was going home. She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You tell them," she whispered. "I meant no harm." He didn't understand the words, but he met her gaze, steady, grateful. Then, before the riders reached the plain below, he was gone, slipping out the back door and vanishing into the tall grass, as silent as smoke. Clara stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway, her breath shallow. The hoofbeats faded. The sun climbed higher. When at last the land was quiet again, she whispered into wind, "Please, Lord, let that be the end of it." But deep down, in the stillness of her heart, she already knew it wasn't over. The sun had burned low all afternoon, turning the Texas plains a color of rust and blood. Heat shimmered above the grass, and even the cicadas had grown quiet. Clara spent the day in silence, working because she didn't know what else to do. Her hands scrubbed the same pot twice. Her eyes kept flicking to the window. Every sound, the creak of the roof, the flap of a loose shutter, made her heart skip. By late afternoon, she'd stopped pretending to work. She just sat by the window, watching the horizon. Then she saw it, a faint line of dust rising beyond the hills. It wasn't wind. It wasn't cattle. It was riders. Her mouth went dry. She stood slowly, her heart thudding against her ribs. "Dear God," she whispered, "they found me." The dust cloud grew, spreading wider, until she could make out shapes. Horses, dozens of them, moving in a loose formation, glinting with flashes of metal and paint. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. the rifle, the lantern, the door latch. She went through each in silence, her breath trembling. By the time the first riders appeared on the ridge, the sun was half gone, a burning orange coin sinking into the plains. They came in from the west, silhouettes against the dying light, proud, straight-backed men in paint and feathers. The air carried their scent, leather, sweat, dust, and smoke. Clara stepped onto the porch, rifle across her arms. The boards creaked under her boots. The riders fanned out, surrounding the cabin in a slow, perfect circle. There must have been 20 of them, maybe more. Their ponies snorted and stamped, tossing their heads. At their head rode a man unlike the rest, tall, broad-shouldered, his face hard as carved stone. He wore a buffalo horn headdress and a coat of beaded hide that glowed in the sunset light. The Comanche chief. He dismounted with deliberate grace, the soft jingling of his gear, the only sound in the world. Every motion was calm, but Clara felt the air crackle with power. He said something in Comanche, low, measured, commanding. The warriors fell silent, their spears and rifles still, their eyes burning holes through her. Clara tightened her grip on the rifle, but didn't raise it. "I mean no harm," she called out, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound firm. "The boy, your boy, I helped him." The chief's gaze swept over her like the shadow of a hawk. Then, to her astonishment, the crowd of riders parted. A small figure emerged from behind the chief's horse. Tawa, alive, whole, dressed now in clean buckskin, with his hair freshly braided. The boy saw her and smiled faintly. Then he spoke to the chief, fast, passionate, gesturing toward her with both hands. The warriors murmured among themselves, eyes shifting from Clara to their leader. The chief listened, silent as stone. Then he looked at Clara again. His eyes, dark and steady, met hers without a flicker of emotion. He spoke a few words to one of his men, who stepped forward and, in broken English, said, "Tawa, your son. You help," he tell chief. Clara nodded, lowering the rifle slowly. "Yes," she said softly. "He would have died if I hadn't found him." The interpreter translated. The chief's jaw tightened. Then, without warning, he walked forward until he stood no more than 3 feet from her. Clara's breath caught. The man was immense, the air around him thick with authority. But his eyes held no rage now, only gravity, a kind of solemn judgment. He reached up to his chest and untied a string of carved bone in turquoise. The piece looked ancient, polished smooth by years of wear. He extended it toward her. Clara blinked. "What's this?" The interpreter said softly, "Gift. You saved Chief's son." The chief said something else then, a short phrase, quiet but filled with weight. The interpreter hesitated, then added, "You say your heart brave." Clara's eyes stung suddenly. She swallowed, taking the necklace with shaking hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't owe me." The chief raised a hand, stopping her. Then, to her surprise, he turned to his warriors and made a signal. One by one, they dismounted. From their saddlebags they brought bundles, deer hides, beadwork, dried meat baskets, and furs. They laid them gently in the dust at her feet. Clara stared, speechless. It was a peace offering, a gesture of honor. Tawa smiled at her shyly from beside his father. The setting sun caught his face in gold. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was a low whine of the wind and the crackle of her cabin's chimney fire. Then the chief looked back at her and said something final, a farewell, perhaps, before turning to mount his horse. The riders began to move, their silhouettes dark against the dying light. But before they vanished beyond the ridge, Tawa turned and raised a small hand. Clara lifted hers in return, her throat tight with emotion. The sound of hooves faded into the dusk, leaving only the wind, the necklace in her palm, and the echo of a boy's small voice calling back through the red horizon. That night, as she stood on her porch beneath a sky full of fire-colored clouds, Clara realized she hadn't just saved a boy. She'd crossed a line few dared to cross, the fragile, invisible border between fear and faith, between enemy and neighbor, between two worlds that had never trusted one another. And somehow, by grace alone, she'd survived it. The sun had long disappeared behind the red mesas when Clara realized the riders weren't leaving after all. Their silhouettes lingered along the hills, distant shapes against the twilight, quiet and unmoving. A few small fires began to glow near the tree-line, flickering like watchful eyes. The Comanche were camping nearby. Clara stood on her porch, one hand clutching the carved bone necklace the chief had given her. The air was cool now, the scent of sagebrush, and with smoke rolling in slow waves across the plains. Every instinct told her to bolt the door, to hide inside. But something, perhaps that calm, wordless understanding in the chief's eyes, kept her rooted where she stood. After a moment, she lit her own lantern and hung it by the door, as if to say, "I am not afraid." The night came alive with sounds. Horses snorted in the dark. Drums murmured faintly somewhere beyond the creek. Voices rose, soft, rhythmic chants that seemed to blend with the whispering wind. Then came a rustle near her fence. Clara turned sharply, her heart jumping, and saw a small figure emerge from the dark. Tawa. He was barefoot, his small hands holding something wrapped in hide. He approached slowly, watching her face for permission. Clara stepped forward, her lantern casting a warm circle of light over him. "You came back," she said softly. He said something in Comanche, smiling faintly, then opened the bundle. Inside were strips of smoked meat and a small pouch of ground maize. "For me?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded and pressed it toward her chest. Then, with a shy bow of his head, he turned and pointed back toward the glow of the Comanche fires. Clara hesitated only a moment before answering. "Wait," she said. She ducked inside her cabin and returned with a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "For your family," she whispered, placing it in his hands. The boy grinned, teeth flashing white in the lantern light. He ran off into the dark, his laughter swallowed by the wind. Clara stood there for a long time, clutching the pouch of maize to her chest. For the first time in years, she smiled. Later that night, when the stars burned bright and clear, Clara found herself walking toward the Comanche camp. She didn't know why, only that her fear had turned into something else. Curiosity, hope. As she approached, the soft murmur of voices fell silent. Dozens of eyes turned toward her. The chief rose slowly from beside the fire, his tall form outlined in orange light. He studied her with quiet surprise, but not anger. Clara lifted both hands, palms open. "I come in peace," she said quietly. "I mean no harm." He regarded her for a long time, then nodded once, a gesture of welcome. A young warrior came forward, offering her a place near the fire. She hesitated, then sat. The chief spoke, his tone low and steady, his words translated by a man sitting beside him. "You saved Chief's son, you brave woman. We remember that." Clara bowed her head. "I didn't think. I just couldn't let him die." The chief listened. Then, through the translator, he said, "Comanche and white man, not friends. Too much blood. But tonight," he gestured to the sky, where stars shimmered above them. "Tonight we eat under one sky." Someone passed her a bowl of stew, spicy, rich with wild herbs. She accepted it with both hands, nodding in thanks. Across the fire, Tawa sat proudly beside his father, grinning at her between mouthfuls. They shared no common tongue, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that only comes when fear finally loosens its hold. When the meal ended, the chief stood and looked toward her cabin glowing faintly in the distance. He said something that made the translator hesitate, searching for words. Finally, the man said softly, "You say your heart strong. You live alone, not weak woman. Maybe brave as warrior." Clara smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "I'm no warrior," she said. But the chief shook his head once, firmly. "Warrior of spirit," the translator added. Tawa reached for her hand, placing a small carved bead in her palm. "For luck," he said, one of the few English words he knew. The night breeze lifted, carrying the scent of smoke and cedar. For a brief, impossible moment, Clara felt the lines between her world and theirs blur, fade, and vanish altogether. Two worlds, two hearts, one quiet fire. When she returned to her cabin near midnight, She didn't bar the door. She simply blew out the lantern, lay down beside the dying hearth, and whispered prayer thanks, not to be kept safe, but for the first peace she'd known in years. Outside, from across the dark valley, a soft drumbeat rose again, slow, steady, like a heartbeat echoing across the plains. The dawn came quietly. A thin veil of mist hung low over the prairie, turning the world pale silver. Clara rose from her bed of quilts, the echo of the drumbeat still thrumming faintly in her ears. She looked toward the horizon. The Comanche camp was still there, smoke curling upward into the morning sky. She didn't know what drew her back that day. Maybe it was the carved bead in her pocket, maybe the memory of Tawa's laughter, or maybe the silent gratitude in the chief's eyes. Whatever it was, it guided her feet down the narrow trail, through the sagebrush. When she reached the camp, several warriors stood guard. They looked at her, then nodded her through. Word had already spread. The woman who saved the boy had returned. The chief was seated beside a small fire, sharpening a knife with slow, methodical movements. Tawa played with two other children nearby, his laughter ringing like a bird's call through the still air. Clara waited until the chief looked up. He said something low in Comanche, gesturing for her to sit. The translator, the same man from the night before, appeared beside them. Chief say, "You are welcome again." Clara smiled faintly. "I didn't expect your people to stay so close." The translator spoke her words, and the chief answered quietly. He say, "White men move into land more each moon. He must keep his eyes open." She nodded, understanding. "You're protecting your home." The chief looked at her, his expression solemn but not hostile. "Yes," the translator said. "Home, family, spirit of ancestors." For a moment, silence stretched between them, not empty, but full. Clara reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of cloth. Inside was a silver locket, worn smooth from years of touch. She held it out carefully. "My husband," she said softly, opening to reveal a tiny sketch of a man in uniform. "He died near San Antonio. Fever took him." The chief studied the picture for a long while. Then, slowly, he reached into a pouch tied at his belt and took out a strip of red-dyed leather adorned with a single eagle feather. He placed it gently in her hands. The translator murmured. He say, "His wife, too, gone to spirits. This feather is from her horse. He give it to you, honor for the life you saved." Clara's throat tightened. She pressed the feather to her heart, her voice trembling. "Tell him, I'll treasure it. Always." The chief nodded solemnly. "We both lose much," he said in his own tongue, through the translator. "But life still walk. Heart still fight." Clara blinked back tears. "Yes," she whispered. "The heart still fights." As the day warmed, she helped grind maize beside the Comanche women, who watched her with curious but gentle eyes. They laughed softly when she clumsily used their tools, and before long one of them pressed a bit of blue paint to her cheek, a sign of inclusion. Tawa darted between them, carrying sticks, chasing a puppy, always smiling. And when the sun began to set, Clara found herself seated again beside the chief's fire. He was watching the horizon, where, far away, a new line of wagons could be seen crawling across the plains. "The white people keep coming," she said quietly. The chief did not need a translation. He simply nodded, his face carved in the amber light. "Soon," he said haltingly in English. No sky left. Clara swallowed hard. "And yet there's good in some of us," she said. "You saw it in that river." He turned to her, eyes dark and steady. "Good heart, not color," he said. "Only heart." The word struck deep, simple, true, and powerful. They sat in silence, firelight dancing between them, the feather and the locket glinting softly in the glow. Then the chief stood and offered her a small clay cup filled with strong-smelling tea. "Peace," he said in English, raising it slightly. Clara mirrored the gesture. "Peace," she echoed. They drank together, and though they spoke little more that night, something sacred passed between them, a bond beyond words, beyond tribe or blood. As the stars rose over the camp, Clara knew something had changed, not just between her and the Comanche, but within her, For years she had lived with ghosts. Now, she had found the living again. And though she didn't know it yet, the next dawn would bring a test that would seal this fragile peace, or break it forever. The first gunshot split the dawn like thunder. Clara jolted awake, the coffee cup slipping from her hands. The sound had come from the east ridge, followed by the whinny of frightened horses. She ran to the porch, heart pounding. In the dim morning light, she saw movement, riders, white men, a group of 6 or 7 settlers on horseback, rifles raised, heading straight toward the Comanche camp. Panic surged in her chest. They must have seen the smoke, assumed it was a raiding party. "No, no!" she gasped. Without thinking, Clara grabbed her shawl and ran, feet pounding across the cold, dew-soaked grass. The air filled with the crack of more gunfire. She could hear shouting now, angry English voices, and startled cries in Comanche. By the time she reached the ridge, chaos had already broken loose. Warriors were rushing to mount their horses, women pulling children back into the brush. Smoke curled where a campfire had been kicked over. The settlers were yelling, "Keep them back! Don't let them flank us!" While the Comanche shouted in defiance, arrows notched, ready to defend. And between them stood Clara. She threw up both arms and screamed, "Stop!" The sound startled both sides. A rifle cracked beside her, the bullet hitting the dirt inches from her feet. But she didn't move. "Hold your fire," she cried again, turning toward the settlers. "They're not attacking you." The leader of the settlers, a grizzled rancher with a scar across his cheek, stared at her in disbelief. "Clara, what the hell are you doing? Get out of the way." She stepped closer, shaking with fury. "You'll shoot over my dead body," she said. "These people haven't hurt anyone." Behind her, the Comanche chief appeared, tall and still as stone. Tawa clung to his side, wide-eyed but brave. The chief said something in his own tongue, low, calm, like the voice of the earth itself. The translator stepped forward and shouted to the settlers, "Chief say, he come in peace. He come to thank white woman who saved his son." The men hesitated, rifles wavering. The rancher spat in the dust. "Peace? They burned my cousin's farm last winter. You expect me to trust him?" Clara turned on him, her voice breaking. "And how many of their homes were burned before that? How many children buried in both our graves? When does it stop?" For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The prairie held its breath. Then Tawa, small, silent Tawa, stepped forward. He reached into his pouch and took out something shiny. The little carved bead Clara had returned to him earlier. He held it up to the rancher and said in halting English, "Peace." The word hung in the air like a bell. The men shifted uneasily. One by one, they lowered their rifles. The rancher muttered something under his breath, then finally holstered his gun. "Reckon we don't need more ghosts," he said gruffly. The chief nodded once, a gesture of respect. Clara's knees nearly buckled with relief. She looked at the chief, then at the settlers, and said softly, "Then let's start here. Let this be the day we stop the killing." That morning, under the first light of the rising sun, the chief and the rancher met halfway across the field. They clasped wrists, not as friends, not yet, but as men who understood loss and survival. Clara stood between them, her shawl blowing in the wind, her eyes shining with tired gratitude. Tawa ran up beside her, slipping his small hand into hers. She smiled down at him, whispering, "You've got your father's courage." He grinned. "And your heart," he said softly. Her breath caught. The words, simple as they were, felt like a prayer. The chief approached her then, holding out something wrapped in deer hide. Inside was a small hand-carved wooden figure, a woman standing beside a fire. "From memory," the translator said. He say, "Fire a brave heart never die." Clara closed her hand around it, her eyes glistening. "Tell him it burns brighter today." The chief nodded. Then, with a gesture, he and his people turned their horses westward, disappearing one by one into the golden mist. By the time the sun rose fully, only hoofprints and a few lingering trails of smoke remained. Clara stood alone in the wide, silent field, the feather in her hair stirring gently in the breeze. For the first time since her husband's death, She didn't feel alone. She looked toward the horizon, where two trails, one of settlers, one of Comanche, diverged but ran side by side for a while. Between two worlds, she whispered, there's still hope. And somewhere far off, the faint beat of a drum echoed once more, steady, strong, eternal.